This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan, and I am here with Dr. Alex Mesoudi. Alex, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Alex Mesoudi. I'm a professor of cultural evolution at the University of Exeter in the UK.
Yeah, cultural evolution. So this is a super fascinating topic for me. It's a field that's been around for a while. I would date it at least as far back as the 1970s and 80s with Cavalli-Sforza's and Feldman's early work, and also Wilson and Lumsden, and obviously Boyd and Richardson. But you can talk about it a little bit more in detail in the history, perhaps, just to set the stage. But I do want to say you wrote a book, Cultural Evolution: How Darwinian Theory Can Explain Human Culture and Synthesize the Social Sciences. I read this book; it's a really good, small, short textbook. But that subhead is pretty bold, and I think a lot of normal people out there will be surprised at that sort of claim. So, can you just set the stage for your project, where you're starting, where it came from, and where you guys want to go?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can give you a bit about my history. So I started out in psychology. My undergrad was in psychology, and then kind of got a bit disillusioned with psychology and all of the kind of very proximate, kind of detailed, really good, but kind of very nuts and bolts kind of perceptual studies and studies of cognition. So I was always interested in something a bit broader and a bit more large scale, trying to understand humans as a whole species, which got me into kind of evolutionary psychology, which was good as far as it went, but it's kind of a bit crude in its assumptions about genetic instincts and the genetic basis of human cognition. So that kind of led me to cultural evolution as a field, as you mentioned. There, as he kind of started off in the 70s and 80s and kind of picked up in the 1990s and 2000s, which kind of tries to link culture with evolution to explain human and other species behavior. So it's kind of a middle way between more gene-focused disciplines like evolutionary psychology or going back sociobiology on the one hand, and the traditional social sciences on the other hand, which tend to focus on culture and cultural variation and social social structures, but without any evolution, yeah, in the mainstream social sciences. So it's trying to integrate culture into evolutionary science, in order to explain human behavior, which, as people in the field of cultural evolution argue, is sort of co-constituted by both our genetic history, our genetic legacy as a species, but also our cultural legacies, the culture that we inherit from other people within society. So those initial attempts that you mentioned there by Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman and Boyd and Richerson, they were kind of very hardcore mathematical models, sort of drawing on the traditions of population genetics that Fisher and Haldane and Wright used in the early part of the 20th century to try and formalize Darwin's idea of evolution. Basically, what Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman and Boyd and Richerson tried to do was the same for culture. So by culture, we mean everything that is socially transmitted from individual to individual through imitation or spoken or written language or artifacts like books. So we're talking about sort of knowledge, attitudes, skills, artifacts themselves, institutional rules, all of these things that are passed on non-genetically from individual to individual. And so they tried to sort of formalize an evolutionary theory of cultural change. And that led to lab experiments and phylogenetic studies with real world data and all kinds of other attempts to try and study culture scientifically within an evolutionary framework.
Yeah. So back when I was at UC Davis, I used to sit in on some of Richard McElreath's
Hmm.
lab meetings, and so I'm familiar with the whole group, and I've met Pete Richardson. It's a really, really interesting, fascinating, and I'm quite sympathetic to this viewpoint. But I do have to say, when I introduce it to normal people, uh, there's a wide range of reactions. In a minority of cases, they're quite interested and excited, but quite often it goes from bewilderment to rejection. So often people will say, "Well, that's really reductionistic," uh, which it kind of is. So I mean, how do you just react to that? Because I just say, well, I mean, you can appreciate culture in terms of a symphony and kind of just take it in naturally and intuitively. But you can also try to understand it analytically, and this is just a really, really straightforward model based framework to do that. So, I mean, what's your reaction to people who just don't get it?
Yeah, well, I guess people don't get it for various reasons. I guess that's one of them. That sort of coming from the traditional social sciences, or humanities in particular, tend to take that argument. I guess it's what Richard Dawkins wrote about in his book Unweaving the Rainbow. We can appreciate the beauty of a rainbow, but we can also understand the physical processes by which a rainbow comes about. The two are not mutually exclusive. So that's kind of what cultural evolution researchers try to do. It's appreciate the cultural diversity of our species and the many diverging cultural lineages that have led different societies to where they are today, but to try to do that within a scientific framework and within a framework that is consistent with the evolutionary sciences, which, after all, is the bedrock of the natural sciences as a whole. So, yeah, I'm perfectly happy being described as a reductionist. That's kind of what the scientific method is all about. We've got a complex reality, and we need to understand that complex reality using simplified models, using lab experiments, using quantitative methods to try and understand cross-cultural diversity. And we're not arguing that culture is simple or isn't complex. These are just methods to try and understand that complex reality. And there's very few things I think as complex as culture and cultural change in the world to try to understand. So that's from that side. From biologists, often you get the opposite reaction, which is, what is this nefarious, nebulous concept culture? It's a bit fuzzy. Uh, you know, everything is selfish genes, and why aren't we still with sociobiology? So trying to understand everything in terms of inclusive fitness and the standard tools of social evolution. To which I guess the response is that humans have a huge reliance on cultural information in order to live in all the different diverse environments that we live in, making it into space. All the things that our species has done that other species haven't is largely down to our accumulated body of cultural information, cultural knowledge that has accumulated over generations and generations, and lots of the cultural diversity, behavioral diversity that we see in the world is culturally inherited rather than genetically specified. So yeah, I guess it's like I said before, we're kind of trying to take a middle ground between the social sciences and the humanities that have tended to eschew science and evolution on the one hand, but also try to take culture seriously, um, and add that to sort of standard sociobiological social evolution frameworks.
Yeah, I want to follow up with this issue relating to theory,
Yeah.
which you alluded to, and Mutu Krishna and Henrik had a paper a couple of years ago about psychology and theory, and how cultural evolution, these fields, they bring theory really to the fore. But I do want to bring up a quick example. I remember it was 2008 now. I was at a party in Berkeley, and just this is back when I didn't have a Kindle, and I had one of Boyd and Richardson's books, and a friend of mine was asking what this was, and I kind of tried to explain. So I was reading a chapter on environmental change, and whether individual learning or social learning, and learning from the group was more important. And so, from a cultural evolutionary perspective, like one of the ideas is, well, if the environment is really, really stable, uh,
Mm.
there's really not that much point in learning everything anew and being super innovative because everyone else has already done it really well, right? Now, if you're, faced with new environmental circumstances that's very protean, it's changing all the time. Obviously, the trade off of learning by yourself and figuring things out versus just learning what everyone else has always done is going to be different because what else has always done is not going to be appropriate to the new environmental conditions. And
Mm.
so I think just like using this sort of thinking can be really fruitful. I do have to say the reaction was like quite quizzical. So I don't think that people were quite ready yet to think about it that way. But I think the key here is just like having a model in mind is important. Now you said you came out of psychology,
Yeah.
and Mudu Krishna and Henrik, who are your colleagues in this field, they've criticized psychology in part because where's your theory? Like without a theory, you just have all these empirical results, and you write kind of, I don't know if ad hoc stories is not correct, but they're not really well scaffolded, right? Do you
Mm.
think that's a good criticism?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, my first degree was in psychology, but I guess now I'm in a biology department. I spent time in an anthropology department, so I try and hop between disciplines as much as I can. Yeah, I think that's definitely a fair criticism of psychology. There's all the methodological criticisms that people have been leveling at psychology in terms of the replication crisis and the small samples and the bias samples. But I think Mike Muthukrishna and Joe Henrich kind of added a valuable point to that, which is the lack of a theoretical framework. And they and me would argue that evolutionary theory provides that framework. So, for example, theory in psychology, in social psychology, I guess I'm focusing on here, does tend to be on the descriptive side. So you find in experiments that people identify with their social group, and you explain that in terms of social identity theory. It's not really an explanation. It's just taking the thing that you've observed and putting theory at the end of its name. Um, but so I guess that's what evolutionary theory is all about. It's building models to try and explain where things came from, and then you can start thinking about, maybe you've got different groups competing with one another, which means that group identity would be important. And so, what are the payoffs of following your own group versus other groups in what kinds of environments, as you just mentioned there, in terms of spatially or temporally varying environments. So it's kind of going steps backwards and thinking, well, how does this evolve? Just like biologists observe the natural world and then build models and come up with evolutionary theories to try to explain the origins of bird beaks or bowerbird nests or whatever amazing things we find in the natural world. It's the same aim with the immense cultural diversity and cultural complexity that we see. I guess we haven't really talked about cultural evolution itself as the sort of analogy at the heart of the field of cultural evolution, which is that, I guess, cultural change we see as an evolutionary process, and that's the kind of link to the evolutionary sciences. So, cultural change, so changes in skills and beliefs and knowledge and so on, we can see that cultural change as an evolutionary process, which kind of works in parallel to genetic evolution. So, cultural evolution at its heart is drawing this analogy between genetic evolution on the one hand and cultural change, cultural evolution on the other. And so that's kind of where the models start off with examining, how did this process of cultural evolution kind of take off and take over from genetic evolution, and what kinds of dynamics do we see within the process of cultural evolution that might be similar or might be different to genetic evolution. And again, so then you get this sometimes called dual inheritance or gene culture coevolution, where you've got both genetic evolution going on. You've got the capacity for cultural evolution, capacity for culture genetically evolving, but then you've got cultural evolution taking off in a semi-independent fashion and driving human behavior into all these different new, exciting equilibria that you wouldn't expect with just genetic evolution.
Yeah. So actually, I think maybe we need to explore this contrast a little bit more because with when people think of evolution, I think the lay people, actually not just lay people. I mean, I'm quoting a neuroscientist friend of mine. Well, evolution's just dinosaurs. So they
Mm,
think of like morphological change over time and, time and space, there's variation in morphology and external characteristics. If you're a geneticist, you naturally think of change in allele frequencies, genetic variants, right? So John Maynard Smith, the great evolutionary biologist, would always kind of joke that evolutionary game theory had an advantage over the economics, because they had a much better currency to track fitness, which is just alleles, right? Gene
mm.
frequencies. Whereas economists had to use other sorts of proxies in terms of their utility maximization, which he thought were cruder. Uh, with cultural evolution, I think one of the questions, the problems, is, I mean, what are you tracking when you're saying evolution, right?
Mm.
It's all basically just phenotype, right? Culture is a phenotype. And so, like, what is being inherited here? Like, how do you conceptualize it?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I guess I would go back a bit further to Darwin, and I guess we can argue whether cultural evolution is Darwinian. So to me, evolutionary theory kind of started with Darwin, and in The Origin of Species, Darwin laid out three kind of key characteristics or three key requirements for evolution to operate. One was variation, the second is sort of some inheritance process, and the third is what he called a struggle for existence or competition, or what we might call selection nowadays. So I guess when I conceptualize cultural evolution, when I argue that cultural change is an evolutionary process, I guess what I'm arguing is that we can apply those same three key characteristics to cultural change. So words and skills and religious beliefs and so on vary across individuals and across societies. They're inherited, not genetically, but as we mentioned, so we're talking about cultural things. So they're transmitted, inherited socially through imitation or spoken or written language, and there's almost inevitably going to be some kind of competition or selection. So you can't be both a Christian and a Muslim at the same time. You can't learn all 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world. There's going to be some kind of selection process such that not all traits are going to persist from generation to generation. So basically, that's kind of what I see as cultural evolution, applying those three key Darwinian properties to cultural change, and then from that comes diversification in sort of big language evolutionary trees, as we see with language families, Indo-European languages all diversifying, for example, just like species diversify in trees. We see extinction of cultural traits, just like we see extinction of species. We see sort of vestigial features like QWERTY keyboards, originally invented to slow down typists to stop typewriter keys jamming. So we still have those. It's kind of like a vestigial feature, just like appendices in genetic evolution. Convergent evolutions, the same things cropping up in different parts of the world. So you get all these knock-on sort of parallels. So I guess that's what I would understand as cultural evolution, applying those three. And of course, Darwin himself had no real knowledge of genetics. Famously, he had Mendel's manuscript on his shelf, but the pages were uncut, so he never actually read Mendel, and genetics really only came after he died, was integrated much later into evolutionary theory. So you don't need to know much about genetics, or you don't need all the details of genetics in order to have an evolutionary process, or the evolutionary process that Darwin laid out in The Origin. So that's the kind of argument. But that's not to argue that genetic evolution and cultural evolution are identical. There are many differences. The gene thing is a good one, as you mentioned. Your sort of neuroscientist friend was skeptical, and we don't really have as good an understanding of what's going on at the transmission level, what the mechanisms of inheritance of culture are. We don't really understand how information is stored in the brain and passes from one brain to another in much detail at all. Certainly nowhere near as detailed as we understand how genes are stored in DNA and are passed from parents to offspring. I guess that's another difference. So genetic evolution is or parents to offspring. Cultural evolution can be from teachers to pupils, can go up the generations in the other way when parents learn from children, so there are much more pathways of inheritance. You get, different kinds of dynamics governing cultural selection as you do natural selection. So it's kind of taking that core that Darwin pointed out, variation, inheritance, and selection, applying that to culture, and then exploring all the different ways in which cultural evolution is similar to or different to genetic evolution, all utilizing the concepts and tools and methods that we can borrow from evolutionary biology to take us on that journey.
Yeah. Well, you hit a lot of topics there, and so I want to just kind of like summarize and reframe a little bit for the listener. So you point out Darwin had no theory of inheritance. Darwin's books, his ideas, his theories came decades before genetics was really a field that started in the first decade of the 20th century, even though Mendel obviously was working contemporaneously with Darwin. His experiments with peas just really didn't make a huge impact. Uh, so, evolutionary theory is pre genetic in its origins. On the other hand, you alluded to Fisher, Haldane, and Sewell Wright. And in the 1920s and 1930s, they created this explicit model based framework using Hardy Weinberg equilibrium and deriving an algebra from that about how genetics could be fused with evolution. And this was an essential part of the modern neo Darwinian synthesis. And so, you bring up cultural evolution, how it's different and similar to genetic evolution or biological evolution. And I think one way that I explain it to people is that biological evolution is a bit, I don't want to say straitjacketed, but it's really constrained, at least in humans, in some ways, because it's constrained by genetic processes, by, the two Mendelian laws of segregation, independent assortment. Uh, it's actually not totally true in bacteria, for example, though,
Hmm.
where you have a lot of lateral gene flow, right? And so, in a way, when it comes to culture, uh, there's a lot more freedom. So you can have lateral, there's vertical transmission, there's horizontal transmission, there's extremely biased transmission. So in biological evolution, we have a concept called segregation disorders, which basically is a deviation from Mendel's law of segregation. So that, you have like 50% of your genes from each parent, right? But there are distorters out there that skew the process in meiosis and whatnot. And so you can get a situation where there's extreme bias and a particular genetic variant self-select for itself in the transmission process. The details are not super relevant. There's different ways you do it. It's a fascinating scientific discipline, but or scientific idea. But this is the exception to the rule. But in cultural evolution, if you want to use the analogy, there's segregation disorders all over the place where, there's all sorts of biases going on. Uh, so we have these similar models, these similar frameworks, these, you know, similar intellectual traditions and roots, basically. But culture is very fundamentally different from biology in some ways. And I want to illustrate this, and I want to get your opinion on this of group selection. This idea of group selection, which is intuitively obvious to people. People often think that selection, adaptation is occurring at the level of the species, which most biologists will totally reject now. This goes back to some arguments in the 1960s that began with Wynne Edwards and kind of ended with G.C. Williams. And basically, the conclusion of this was summed up in Dawkins' selfish gene. And the argument is that selection operates at the level of the individual or the gene mostly. Now, theoretically, it could operate at a higher level of structure and organization, the group, the deme, which is just the population. But on the whole, most biologists are skeptical of this process, at least for eukaryotic complex social organisms like humans and mammals and whatnot, right? Um,
Hmm.
and the reason is the math just doesn't work. So when you think of two human populations that are next to each other, the gene flow is just too high to maintain really strong differences between the two populations. And if you don't have strong differences between the populations, how is selection operating at the level of the population? Because selection operates on heritable variation. Without heritable variation in biological selection, selection has no power to cause change over the generations. So this is just a kind of a mathematical theory based argument. I think it, on the whole, it is correct. You could have a situation like, oh well, the West Saxons and the East Saxons. I'm just giving you a stylized example. West Saxons and East Saxons have been fighting for hundreds of years, and they're rivals because they're next to each other. But genetically they're very similar. And that's just because the way biological evolution and genetics works, you don't need that much gene flow between populations to prevent divergence. Um, in contrast with culture, it's a whole different can of beans. And that's because culture, you can have really, really huge group differences really fast in cultural traits. And most of those differences can be between the groups. And so the argument here is that group level selection effects do make sense for a culture, and I've been broadly persuaded that this could be a thing. What is your opinion on this sort of debate?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good summary. I guess yeah, I'm sympathetic, not entirely 100% convinced by these ideas, but yeah, it seems a lot more plausible, as you say, that cultural selection can operate on entire groups, cultural groups of individuals, compared to the genetic case. So I think, yeah, I agree. Um, Genetic group selection doesn't seem to work, theoretically, or has been shown to be, or empirically at all. But when you have cultural variation, you have processes like conformity that have been studied a lot in cultural evolution. So if you just copy what the majority of people around you are doing, so again, a kind of simple rule that has been modeled and shown that people follow on in certain circumstances in the lab, then you get group differences. So everyone in one group will be doing one thing, and everyone in another group will be doing a different thing, just because they're each conforming to their different kinds of behaviors. And if those behaviors happen to have something to do with cooperation, for example, then you might get variation between the groups in how cooperative they are, or how effective um, their their warfare technology is, if we're thinking historically. And so those traits are going to affect the survival and persistence of the entire cultural groups. And as you say, so migration is terrible for maintaining between group genetic variation. But if we think about cultural evolution, if people move from group to group, they take their genes with them, but often they will acculturate or assimilate to the cultural norms or cultural beliefs of the group that they find themselves in, if not in one generation, but after a few generations of migration. And so it's a lot easier to maintain between group cultural variation. And once you've got that heritable cultural variation, as you say, you can get selection at the group level. Um, so yeah, it's a really nice theory. The extent to which it has shaped sort of human behavior, human cooperation, human religious beliefs, and etc. over human history is kind of debated, because we're talking about historical processes, and it's very difficult to show sort of cohesive groups throughout history persisting for long enough for selection to act on those groups. But the work of people like Peter Turchin, who've been simulating the rise and fall of empires in Eurasia over the last few thousand years, and fitting them to these cultural group selection models, it seems pretty plausible that this between group competition has affected sort of human cooperative behavior and religious beliefs, and so on. I guess the key thing as well is it doesn't have to require group extinction, which is another difference to the genetic group selection model. So in genetic group selection, you would have to have the extinction of some groups and the survival of other groups, whereas with cultural group selection, all of the groups could persist, but the losing groups, in inverted commas, could just convert to the
Yeah.
cultural beliefs in a single generation of the superior or winning groups. Or you can have sort of preferential migration, even where people are more likely to move to more successful societies. I guess we see that all the time in the contemporary world, where people move from the developing to the developed world. So it can be sort of preferential migration rather than just sort of crude group extinction and group survival.
Yeah, I do want to go back to an issue why this sort of question is interesting to me. And I want to get your sense of it. So in the 1960s, W.D. Hamilton developed the theory of inclusive fitness, which you alluded to earlier. And basically, inclusive fitness just means that, well, your relatedness to your siblings is one half, your relatedness to your cousins is one eighth. And so you have a situation where you can imagine altruism towards close kin evolving because you share genes with them. And so, if you, do something that allows your sibling to flourish and have more offspring, indirectly that's copying your genes as well, diluted by one half, right? And so, I think Haldane famously said he would, you know, sacrifice his life for two siblings, for like, was it like eight cousins, something like that. It's just, just like in proportion to relatedness. And Hamilton presented the theory of inclusive fitness as a formal framework, using the model of Hymenoptera and haplodiploid insects. We don't need to get into the details, but it just shows how genetically this could evolve just through relatedness and being driven by the inclusive fitness logic. I am convinced that inclusive fitness is not sufficient to explain the complexity, the problem of altruism and sociality in humans. I think it's important. I think it's obviously there, but I don't think it's the full explanation. And in the 70s and 80s and onward, Dawkins and some of his colleagues have kind of tried to extend this sociobiological inclusive fitness logic to explain human societies broadly. And I just don't think that it's very, very convincing to me that it explains everything. It explains the variation. Intergroup selection, interdemic selection is one explanation for social complexity, where more complex, groups basically outcompeted perhaps like less complex, less organized groups. What is your general reaction and beliefs about the origins of altruism, the problem of altruism, and social complexity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question in all of the evolutionary sciences, including cultural evolution. Yeah, I think the issue is that kin selection explains a lot of human behavior. So we think about nepotism and even parents caring for their kids, all easily explained by inclusive fitness, by kin selection. Lots of cooperation is explained by reciprocity, which we also see in some other species. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But then there's lots of human interactions that seem to take place between non-relatives and between, say, anonymous strangers, or between people who we're unlikely to see ever again. At the extreme, I guess, giving blood or giving to charity, where we don't even know who's the recipient of our altruistic behavior, which are quite difficult or almost impossible to explain using just kin selection and reciprocity. It's hard to explain these super cases of altruism. And generally, humans live in massive cooperative societies, way more cooperative, way larger than other non-human primate species, kind of only rivaling eusocial insects in the complexity and size of our societies. But of course, as you mentioned, the eusocial insects are all kind of related to one another, so kin selection explains that. We live in massive societies of non-relatives, and with all these anonymous interactions. So this idea of intergroup conflict, cultural group selection, is, I think, a one plausible explanation for this large-scale cooperation in humans. So we can think back historically, as you mentioned, more cooperative societies where the cooperation here is a cultural trait. It's passed from individual to individual socially, rather than being genetic. So norms for cooperation would have made societies more cohesive, better at solving public goods dilemmas, better at building bridges, better at all coming together in intergroup conflict. And the more cooperative societies would have won out over the less cooperative societies. Like I mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily have to be direct warfare or conflict. It can be, again, sort of preferential migration. So those societies that are more cooperative have better social care systems have better, health services, people tend to preferentially move to those. So that can be a kind of form of cultural group selection as well. But I guess it's the selection of the group level norms rather than individual genes or sort of individual ideas. So yeah, it's a plausible explanation. I guess other people argue um, uh, other theories are available. We can say so. Some people argue that it's all kind of reciprocity writ large with language, say. So language makes it much more effective. Makes reciprocity much more effective, so we can use indirect reciprocity and keep track of our reputations and get social standings, and so that's another way of getting large scale cooperation. But yeah, it's a I guess an ongoing topic of research trying to explain this big question of human large scale cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole field. So we've been talking about cultural evolution and biological evolution as if they're two separate things in a way, but obviously they're related, and you've kind of acknowledged it. And so I just have a question. You know, gene culture coevolution is kind of a thing that's been around for a long time. I feel like in the early work, Wilson and Lumsden, E.O. Wilson and Lumsden in particular, emphasized gene culture coevolution. I don't know how far it's been extended, but I still see it periodically in reviews in cultural evolution. How important do you think gene culture coevolution is? So, for example, like let's say in terms of religious belief, I've read a fair amount of the literature on the cognitive science of religion, and there's all these evolutionary psychological explanations about theory of mind. As you know, Scott Atran's work, Pascal Boyer's work, and how religion evolves. On the other hand, you have variation between societies in the importance and the nature of religion, and even variation over time in our own American culture in, say, the importance of religious belief, where, according to Ronald Inglehart, the United States has gone from being the pretty much the most religious of industrialized of developed nations, say 30 or 40 years ago, to today. uh on average, it's just as secular as most of them, although it's a highly polarized society. And this has happened, in 30 or 40 years. Like, it's, not even more than a generation. So what does you know your field bring to understanding religion, its evolution, change over time, as well as its persistence?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I guess the classic example of gene culture coevolution is sort of lactose tolerance and other cases of sort of physiological evolution, which it's pretty clear to see there's been genetic change. So dairy farming prehistorically led to the spread of lactose tolerant alleles, or other forms of agriculture led to the spread of amylase digestion alleles. So I guess the classic cases of gene culture coevolution, which really just means you've got genetic evolution, you've got cultural evolution, and they're interacting with each other, they're co-evolving, both inheritance systems. The classic cases involve sort of physiological and anatomical changes. I guess when we're talking about religion, then we're talking about something more psychological, obviously. So I guess we can think about how there's maybe been the genetic evolution for the kind of cultural capacities that religion rests on. So I'm thinking of things like conformity, adopting the majority norm in whichever society you happen to be growing up in, or things like prestige biased cultural learning, so where you follow the beliefs of a particularly prestigious or high status individual who may be a priest or an imam in your particular society. So I guess we can say maybe that these kind of psychological capacities which govern who we learn from might be the sort of product of genetic evolution, because in broad senses they're generally adaptive. It's generally adaptive to do what everyone else is doing in your particular environment, or it's generally adaptive if somebody is socially successful, they're doing something right. So odds are you should probably copy some of their behaviors in order to be successful yourself. So broadly, those kind of psychological mechanisms we can see as the product of genetic evolution. But once those are in place, then if we're thinking about those kind of secular sort of short-term changes in popularities of particular religious beliefs, then I guess it's purely in terms of the cultural dynamics. Then we're thinking about the sort of the cultural dynamics that conformity and prestige bias and different kinds of social learning biases would dictate. So I guess, yeah, genetic evolution is probably not relevant for that kind of short-term thing, but it's always in the background. We're always asking, are these psychological mechanisms adaptive? I guess another way to go would be the kind of cognitive byproduct kind of school of thinking about religion, where we've genetically evolved a particular kind of cognition, and many religious beliefs kind of play on that cognition, or play on the kind of things that people find intuitive, or what's sometimes called minimally counterintuitive. So some people argue that religious beliefs are sort of intuitive to some extent. So we got, deities living in the sky. It kind of violates our intuitive notions of physics and biology and how the world works. But then deities are also vengeful, and they're also and they exhibit justice, and they have kind of regular psychological characteristics. So they're kind of unintuitive, but not so unintuitive to be bizarre, but unintuitive enough to be interesting. So it kind of hits a sweet spot within our cognition between intuitive and unintuitive. And so then religious beliefs spread as a result of the way that our cognitive systems have evolved, almost like a byproduct. But then they may shape cooperative norms and sort of cement themselves in that sense. So yeah, I think it adds it by trying to understand the sort of genetic evolutionary origin of the psychological machinery and cognitive machinery within which particular beliefs themselves culturally evolve. So we can kind of see the psychology and the cognition as almost like the adaptive landscape within which these religious beliefs are evolving over the space of decades.
Yeah, so adaptive landscape obviously is a Sewell Wright origin term, goes back to the 1930s. And so we're just talking about landscape of fitness. And, you alluded to the cognitive byproduct theory, which is really, really a big deal in just evolutionary psychological explanations, gone back several decades. And, there's a whole tradition in cultural anthropology of religion. It's not a big tradition, but it starts with, Dan Sperber and Atran, Pascal Boyer, and the people around them. And they talk about how religion is basically, as you said, minimally counterintuitive. It's a byproduct of our cognition. And, Atran in particular, from his writings, it's quite clear to me that he's not much of an adaptationist when it comes to religion. It just seems to be a set of intuitions that emerge out of our our cognitive architecture, right? Structurally. On the other hand, there's obviously religious belief and orthodoxy and rituals and practice, and this seems to be kind of like a higher level behavior that varies across societies and varies over time. So one can imagine a situation where the raw material basically just emerges, say, like a mutation, just randomly out of the background. And then eventually selection operates on that raw material in another given environment. So you can imagine a situation where 2 million years ago, our hominid ancestors had minimally counterintuitive concepts, but they were not organized in social units in a way where those minimally counterintuitive concepts were being used as a raw material for cultural evolution. So I think that's one way that you could resolve it. It's complicated. It's a complicated story, and in science we like parsimony, but sometimes you kind of need to move beyond the simplest explanation to a more complex, more comprehensive explanation, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of why I like the field of cultural evolution as well. It's kind of why I do what I do. It's that interplay between, you've got a complex thing you're trying to explain. Like I said before, there's nothing much more complex in the world than human cultural diversity and change over time and cultural complexity. But we're trying to do that with simple scientific methods. As you mentioned, parsimony is a core concept in science. But yeah, we build these simple models. So we invoke, as I mentioned, simple things like conformity. You do what you do, what others are doing around you. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. A kind of general rule of thumb, or this prestige bias. So you do adopt the behavior of particularly prestigious individuals in your society. Obviously, they're hugely simplified, and reality is way more complex than this. But by invoking these relatively simple sort of heuristics, rules of thumb, you can explain a surprising amount. You can get fashions and fads, and you can get sort of runaway selection for for different kinds of cultural traits, and so you're kind of trying to explain a complex reality in terms of a set of simple principles. And I don't see it as too different, again, to what evolutionary biologists do. We see immense complexity and diversity in the natural world, and you try and boil it down to a few simple principles. Natural selection divided up into directional selection and stabilizing selection and sexual selection and these kind of things, and mutation and recombination and migration. A handful of simple processes that can be used to explain a pretty complex phenomenon. So it's kind of the same tactical approach. Again, not arguing that reality is simple, or people are simple, or people are mindlessly following these kind of simple rules of behavior, but we're trying to explain the complex reality with these relatively simple transmission biases and innovation patterns, and within simple models and lab experiments and real world data.
Well, so speaking of transmission biases, I want to drill down. Just looking at what you've been writing and publishing. So, May 17th, 2021, the Royal Society just put out a review article, Cultural Selection and Bias Transformation, Two Dynamics of Cultural Evolution. So, what is this you're talking about here? I kind of have some idea, but I definitely want you to talk about this for the listeners, just to get a general taste or flavor of the way you think about things as a cultural evolutionist, and the way it breaks down.
Sure, yeah. I guess this is kind of related to what we've been discussing about sort of um, uh, cognitive byproducts and cognitive biases. So I guess there's a kind of debate within the field between people who emphasize what I call in the paper cultural selection. So that's where maybe people use trial and error, or people are sort of doing things, trying to not necessarily solve specific problems, but just trying to make by, and might make mistakes, might mistakenly copy something in a different way, and some things happen to be better than other things. The hand axe that you're copying, you might accidentally copy it and it might be slightly more effective just unintentionally than what you were copying. And so these sort of unintentional errors can be seen as kind of akin to genetic mutation, and then selection kind of selects the more effective variants, and those are preferentially copied by people, again preferentially copying the most successful person within the group who happens to have the better hand axe or whatever tool it is. And so you get this sort of cumulative change over time, not because of individuals being super smart and coming up with amazing ideas in a single generation, but by multiple generations gradually, unintentionally almost, selecting the more effective traits. So that's one idea. On the other hand, you have maybe the sort of more cognitive anthropologists like Dan Sperber and Scott Atran, who are more focused on individual cognition and what's going on inside individual people's heads. And as we mentioned, the sort of what's intuitive and what's not intuitive, and trying to explain how cultural traits change over time in terms of how they fit with people's intuitions, or how individual people's cognition works. So I guess in this paper that just came out in Philosophical Transactions, I was basically trying to integrate these two ways of seeing cultural change: the sort of unintentional accidents that are preferentially selected on the one hand, and the almost transformations by single individuals according to our cognition on the other. I was trying to argue that both of these kinds of processes are going to be important for human cultural change. If we think about complex, opaque technologies, there's a very nice study about violins. So the F holes in violins and guitars. We kind of take it for granted that there are these weird holes in violins, but actually they gradually evolved over literally hundreds of years if you go back through the history of violins. and actually they're pretty effective. The F shape in the violin is, I don't know whether it's technically optimal, but it's as optimal as we can get in terms of improving the acoustics or maximizing the acoustics of the violin. But you can show that no single individual came up with these weird F holes, that they gradually changed over time, much like biological species change gradually over time. Each change in each generation was within the sort of copying error boundaries of the previous generation. So it's almost like violin makers were sort of accidentally playing around, or accidentally changing the holes, or might have elongated the end of the hole accidentally and found, oh, this violin sounds a lot better than the previous violin. Let's keep that shape. And so that's the way that sort of violin F holes kind of gradually evolved. Whereas if you think of something like, what's other examples I used in the paper, something like bloodletting, so the medical practice of making incisions near wounds. If you've got a terrible migraine, you would make an incision in the head and let some so-called bad blood out. It's not very effective. I think this is how George Washington died. He got some infection, and then the doctors at the time used leeches to take out his bad blood. I think he died of a blood infection, if I remember correctly. More to do with the bloodletting rather than the original illness that he had. But this is kind of cognitively intuitive. It's intuitive to try and get the bad stuff out of the body. So why not make an incision and try and get the bad blood out? So again, it's not effective, but it might fit with our cognition, and it's kind of culturally widespread. Bloodletting, if you look across different societies, you find it's quite prevalent. So this probably spread because it fits with our cognition, and people around the world, independently invented it, and it sounds kind of plausible if you haven't got the medical knowledge that we do today.
Yeah.
And so that kind of explains that account. So it's kind of arguing that we can have different explanations for different kinds of cultural change. So the technology is kind of more like genetic evolution, if you like, unintentional, accidental changes that selection grabs onto. But then the cognitive side, we don't really have a parallel in genetic evolution there. It's things sort of fitting with the way that we think. And sometimes they're effective, sometimes, as in the case of bloodletting, not very effective at all.
Well, as you were talking, I was actually thinking about like what is it like in genetic evolution. So, bloodletting or circumcision, there are these behaviors that just seems to pop up over and over again, or say like human sacrifice in multiple societies. And this is not just an idea that spread from like Australian Aborigines, you know they engage in circumcision. Like it's not, to my knowledge, because they got the idea from Jews or Muslims, right? uh and so this is obviously just like something that comes to mind with humans. We can create a just so story about why doing this is something that seems plausible or reasonable to humans, but it seems to happen multiple times. So I mean, in evolutionary genetics, I think the analogy here would be some sort of biased mutational process where there are structures in the genome where mutations are not just some random probability, like some random Poisson process, a rare event, but there are actually positions in the genome that are highly mutable. You're going to see that they mutate constantly. So a classic case is actually the opsin genes for color blindness, and this is why it's on the X chromosome. So that's one reason it expresses in males, but it also happens to be that that location, for whatever reason, is really, really mutable. And so you can imagine these sorts of biased mutational processes. Well, if you think of cognitive science, if you think of our cognition as kind of the raw underlying material for cultural evolution, these sorts of recurrent features, this epidemiology of ideas, I think is what Sperber would say, Dan Sperber, uh, just occur, I think, naturally because of the structure of our cognition, just like we have a structure of our genome, right? So I think that there are analogies and metaphors that can be, which makes sense. Evolution is evolution, whether the substrate is are memes or genes. Now, we haven't like talked extensively about memes, and this is an idea that Richard Dawkins came up with decades ago, and it was kind of, I would say, like 20 years ago, it was kind of dead in the water. As a cultural concept, it was perceived to be a failure. There was a journal of memetics, but I don't think it publishes anymore. Uh, but now with the internet, with Twitter, social media, meme is always on the tip of our tongues. It's just a big deal now. Like, how do you distinguish cultural evolution from quote memetics?
Yeah, it's a curious history, I guess. So as you mentioned, Richard Dawkins coined the word meme and memetics. I think it was in the final chapter of The Selfish Gene, his classic 1976 book. I guess to illustrate again, it's kind of what we're talking about here, the substrate neutrality, the generality of his replicator theory, arguing that uh, we should focus on the replicator, which in biological evolution is the gene, and I guess he argued in cultural change is the meme, which is kind of like the equivalent of the gene, but in cultural evolution. So I guess it had a good head start, or a good start being the concept of the meme being associated with probably the best and most influential popular science book of the latter part of the 20th century, and it kind of bubbled around. So Sue Blackmore wrote a great book called The Meme Machine in the late 90s, I think, around 2000. I guess maybe there are two problems with memes and memetics that means that which led to it kind of not really taking off as a discipline. I guess the first is it kind of forces cultural evolution, cultural change a bit into a bit too close of an analogy with genetic evolution, I think. So once you start talking about memes, then you're thinking about sort of particulate inheritance, that sort of genes are inherited in a kind of all or nothing fashion with their kind of sort of discrete units that are passed down from parents to offspring. Whereas, as you've mentioned already earlier, Razib, cultural evolution is a lot looser than that. So we don't really know if culturally transmitted information comes in discrete packages, units of information. We don't know if they're transmitted in all or nothing fashion. You have things like political beliefs, for example, that seem a lot more continuous. Maybe underlain by sort of discrete particulate inheritance underneath, but we don't really understand how cultural information is stored in the brain or passed from brain to brain in order to say for certainty that memes exist as specific units of information. So it kind of starts you off a bit too close to genetic evolution and restricts you a bit in terms of trying to understand the unique dynamics of cultural evolution. I guess the second reason is that most of the memetics were, and no disrespect to philosophers, but most of them were kind of philosophers or theoretical biologists. None of them really were doing experiments or collecting real world data or doing the sort of quantitative tests, creating theoretical models that you kind of need to do in order to test ideas and test the assumptions of particular theories. So it kind of stayed as a kind of philosophical discussion. I guess Dan Dennett still talks about memes in his work. But it never really resulted in a sort of empirical science. On the other hand, the kind of modeling work that we started off talking about by Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman and Boyd and Richerson, that borrowed the mathematical techniques of population genetics, and so they didn't really use the word meme or memetics, but they built these formal models of cultural change to try and quantify cultural evolution. And that kind of was much more successful in leading to people trying to test their ideas about conformity and prestige and social networks and things, and cultural group selection in the lab, in experiments, in cross-cultural data, and so on. So yeah, and as you said, nowadays memes are cat videos on the internet or pictures of boyfriends looking at other women. I can't pretend to fully understand all the memes that bombard my Twitter feed, but memes are kind of shorthand for catchy things on the internet that spread rapidly, which I guess is what we're kind of studying in cultural evolution. We're studying things that spread culturally, which internet memes are, but I guess we're trying to put a more rigorous theoretical framework onto that and trying to explain why cultural traits spread, whether it's on the internet or in a small scale society or in any other aspect of society.
All right, so I gotta ask some like really specific questions for you, partly because I solicited some questions on the Twitter machine, as they would say. So I'm gonna ask just a couple of specific questions and close out with some big picture questions for you. What is your response to Luke Premo's 2020 critique of copying error logic in the context of proportional error when copying metric traits?
Blimey, that's a very specific question. Probably only me and Luke Primo would be interested in the answers to that, so I won't spend too long. I'm trying to remember what Luke. So I think this was a study that I did years ago with my PhD student Marius Kemp, where we looked at changes in hand axe size, Achillean hand axes. We particularly focused on over time, and we guess it relates to what we've already kind of been discussing about technology. So is it individuals making big intentional changes, or is it more of a population level process and accidental changes? So this accumulated copying error is all about how the size of or shape of a hand axe, if you look at the change over time, you can explain that just in terms of unintentional copying error. So our perceptual systems have certain limits that we can't tell the difference between different sized objects. So we experimentally showed that you can explain changes in hand axe size just in terms of accidental unintentional copying, where nobody is trying to make hand axes bigger or smaller, it's just accidental copying error, and from that you get hand axes that seem to match the archaeological record. I can't remember what Luke. I think Luke had some specific mathematical issue, but I don't think it's worth going into it. Maybe I'll contact Luke and address him
Yeah, so
his point directly.
yeah, I think it had to do with adding population size parameters in terms of the rate of error. Yeah, just like looking at the abstract. So basically, the reason why culture, I mean, what this illustrates is the reason why cultural evolution is cool is people can ask very precise, specific questions and take particular uh, precise issue with your model because you actually have a transparent model. I think a lot of the issues when we talk about culture and the humanities is it's fascinating, but we never get to a resolution because half the time we don't really understand what the other person is really trying to get at because that's just the way verbal logic works.
Yeah. That's a good broader way of summarizing it. I guess that's the advantage of, maybe it links to what we were talking about memetics. Or memetics remain kind of a bit fuzzy and lots of sort of verbal arguments with Dan Dennett and Sue Blackmore, and they're really interesting arguments, but they never really wrote them down in a formal model in a way that people could go out and test experimentally, like me and
Well,
Marius tested that accumulated copying error kind of model, and that Luke has come along and argued that there's something wrong with that model, and so then that kind of iterates over time, and we
well,
hopefully get to a better understanding of hand axe size changes over time. So maybe that's a nice example of what we're trying to do with the field of cultural evolution.
Well, so I want to end talking about cumulative cultural evolution because I think that's what you're illustrating. Like the field of cultural evolution exhibits contingency and there's iterative change over time as people accumulate insights and the models and theories get more refined. Whereas you just alluded to the fact that memetics was dominated by philosophers who are, to be frank, known for uh, re-arguing the debates between Aristotle and Plato to this day. They've kind of been, I mean, I'm gonna get some crap for this, but they've kind of been stuck for 2,500 years, running in circles. Okay, and so that's not cumulative cultural evolution, is it? It's fascinating. I think we all enjoy reading philosophy, and Aristotle and Plato were big brains, but the fundamental issue is like there hasn't been that much progress since then, right? So I do want to ask a question. There's been questions relating to like how much does cultural evolution react to like environmental change, environmental variation, and then how much of it is endogenous, right, to the system within it. And so it's difficult to ask, like, okay, like how do you partition the proportion of variation? I mean, it's almost a not even wrong question, but when you're talking to someone and you're explaining cultural evolution, do you have in your mind a preference for like what kind of pressures, selection pressures, and questions and dynamics that you're focusing on, like endogenous or kind of like exogenous stuff, you know? So, okay, so the climate changes really fast. That's obviously an exogenous shock. Uh, one could argue agriculture is due to climate change. Okay, like this is just whatever. And then the contrasting situation is okay, well, agriculture is actually a due to Malthusian conditions where the population kept increasing due to the hunter gatherers becoming sedentary, utilizing very, very rich resources. But then when the population gets big enough, they need to switch to something, that's more productive on a per unit basis. And this isn't really an adaptation to environment. It's just like an endogenous process as humans kind of change over time to like the situation that they themselves have created, right? How do you frame this?
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's obviously both. I guess just as it is in genetic evolution, you've got exogenous factors and you've got endogenous factors affecting the evolutionary process. So yeah, you've got maybe cultural evolution has become more endogenous over time. Might be an interesting way to interesting line of investigation. I guess as you say, have created agriculture and live in massive cities and um, large populations with all of our fancy technology. We're maybe more buffered from the kind of external climatic or other environmental shocks that would have affected past human societies. So it's more endogenous now. But then again, we've just lived through a pandemic, which I guess we can see as exogenous, and we've had all kinds of culturally evolved responses to the COVID pandemic. So yeah, I think it's going to be both, and it's going to be looking at each case study to look at the extent to which. I guess the key thing is, yeah, what are the endogenous factors? What are the exogenous shocks? And I guess that's what kind of cultural evolution tries to provide. It's a bit more about the endogenous processes that go on within society, and trying to look at how people come up with new solutions to the exogenous shock, perhaps, and how those solutions spread within society in terms of these transmission biases within different sized and shaped social networks. So it's trying to add the nuts and bolts to what is endogenously going on within human societies that allow us to respond to exogenous shocks so well, because undoubtedly we have been able to, because humans have been pretty successful so far in the last few 100,000 years at least.
Yeah, I guess we could say that. So last couple of questions. First question I want to ask is, what is the biggest, the counterintuitive finding that you can think of from cultural evolution to just kind of illustrate its value to people? And so, this question is inspired by, I think the question asked of, I think it was of Paul Samuelson, the economist. Like, what's the biggest finding from economic theory that seems counterintuitive and significant? And his response was comparative advantage. And just for the listener who's not familiar, I mean, basically, comparative advantage in terms of international trade indicates that sometimes it's more beneficial for you actually to do something you're not as good at as opposed to the best thing, because there's somebody out there who can do what you're best at even better, and it's better that you do something else so that you can trade and the utility maximizes optimally. And it's kind of like a refutation of mercantilist competition between nations. Now if someone asked me for population genetics, I think the stylized factor, that counterintuitive thing that I would bring out, is gene flow between populations being only needed. Like, you only need one individual to migrate between populations per generation to prevent genetic divergence from getting out of control, so that the two populations remain genetically indistinguishable. I think that's really counterintuitive to people. There is some, the mathematical logic is not that difficult, but you can Google it. Why? It makes sense. It's one of those facts like you would be, oh, yeah, okay. Why didn't I think of that, right? So for cultural evolution, like what would you say, Alex?
That's a good question. I like the population genetic one. I guess that kind of applies to cultural evolution as well, in an interesting way. So maybe it's the kind of thing we've touched on, but I'll steal sort of Mike Muthu-Krishna and Joe Henrich's idea of the collective brain, maybe the idea that human success as a species, we can't really attribute it to our individual intelligence or our individual genius. It's almost always the accumulated effect of multiple generations and lots of small changes in large populations. So I guess this kind of argues against theories of human evolution which invoke individual intelligence. So, we were evolving and our brains got big and we became individually smart and we invented all these amazing things, and our species is full of these geniuses. I guess people like Joe and Michael and Boyd and Richardson before them argue actually the secret of our success isn't our individual smarts, it's the fact that we can share ideas within societies, and one person makes some mistake and happens to improve something, and everybody else copies that because it's slightly better than what went before, and then you just iterate that over the generations and you get space shuttles or iPhones or all the kind of or democracy, all of the kind of institutions and technologies that we take for granted today, but that no single individual came up with, and no single individual in most cases understands how fully they work. So this has kind of been looked at in the lab by a study I was involved with. So Maxime Derrick's led a study where he got people to place weights on a wheel that rolls down a track, and it's kind of a difficult task to do. You can look at videos online to try and see the task, but you've got to sort of maximize the inertia and the different physical principles. So it's not an intuitive task, and he found that people could get better at it over time, could sort of maximize the time that the speed of the wheel going down, but they had really little understanding of what they were doing. It was just people making relatively random changes, exploring the adaptive landscape, as we've mentioned, and just people tending to preserve what worked best and getting rid of what worked different. So there were no geniuses, there was no major breakthroughs in physics knowledge in the experiment. It's just a very simple process of almost random, semi-random changes plus copying what works well gets you pretty complex things over time. And people have there was a study very recently last year, I think, or even this year, with Hadza Bowman addressing the same kind of questions, showing that Hadza Bowman have a pretty good understanding of how their bows work and the sort of physical constraints of the bows and the arrows that they use, but there were major gaps in their knowledge, and it's hugely effective technology that that is intricately complex, but it wasn't one Hadza Bowman a few generations ago sitting down and thinking, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this. It was many generations of Hadza Bowmen all making slight changes, tinkering with things, and things gradually accumulating in effectiveness over time. So that to me is the interesting, unintuitive concept that our species' success is not because we're smart or intelligent. It's individually, it's because of our sort of collective brain, our ability to get together with other individuals and share knowledge and tinker and accumulate gradually over time, over many generations.
Yeah, before I ask the last question, I want to editorialize a little bit. Um, this insight about how people learn and how people unlearn and how societies can forget things and not relearn it very easily has pretty much transformed my view, to be frank, about international trade, de-skilling, and comparative advantage. Because in economic models, often you just have a situation where you turn the toggle down and, oh, you stop manufacturing. Okay, like what if the situation changes? Okay, you just start manufacturing again. But if learning and skill development and cultural knowledge is much more tacit and less about conscious learning in a very specific way for an individual, I think that really calls into the question the idea that we can just reskill as fast as we de-skilled. And so this is kind of a policy consequence of cultural evolution that I think is super important, has transformed my views. Unfortunately, as Peter Turchin will tell you, economists do not like to listen to anyone who is outside of their discipline. So you have to become an economic cultural evolutionist and get a degree, a PhD from Princeton to influence them. And that is again a feature of the cultural anthropology of science and how it works. Unfortunately, so my last question to you: we've been talking for a while, just really great conversation, and I think listeners learned a lot. But cumulative cultural change. Okay, so this is a big question, just like the problem of altruism. Michael Tomasello has had a lot of ideas, for example, over the years about the cultural ratchet and how we've evolved over time. There's a social brain hypothesis. Uh, as a cultural evolutionist, what are the prospects and the leads that you are following up to figure out, okay, like how are humans in particular, and we're talking about humans because we're the primary cultural animal. I know that some cultural evolutionists focus on other primates and even other animals, but with humans, how are you going to figure out cumulative cultural change? Like, what is your strategy going forward?
It's a good question. Yeah, we've kind of neglected other species. I guess I work on humans, so I tend to use humans in my examples. But I'm happy to happy
Well, I
to.
mean, to my knowledge, my listenership is almost exclusively human, so I think they'll be okay.
Okay. I don't know. My dog might listen back later. But yeah, so I was going to say, I guess this idea of cumulative culture came out from comparisons with other species, which is really interesting. And my PhD advisor Andy Whiten has kind of spearheaded the study of culture in chimpanzees and non-human primates. So I'm happy to accept that non-human species have culture and have cultural traditions, by which we mean they learn things from one another. So chimpanzees will learn how to crack nuts from other chimpanzees in their community, how to ant dip or stick sticks in termite mounds and in a particular way in order to get the ants and the termites out. So we can see these. I'm happy calling that culture because they're behaviors that are passed on from one individual to another through social means. And sometimes they give rise to cultural traditions. So some chimpanzees in one part of Africa dip ants or ant dip in one way, and other groups of chimpanzees in other parts of Africa ant dip in a different way. So just like some human societies use knives and forks and others use chopsticks, we can see these as kind of cultural traditions. What no other species has apart from humans is this idea of cumulative culture. So the idea that cultural knowledge or cultural skills accumulate in efficiency or complexity or effectiveness over the generations. So that's what we clearly see in technology in our lifetimes. We've seen smartphones get infinitely more complex than when we were growing up. Computer technology is the same, transportation, these kind of things, even social systems, political systems will get more and more effective, hopefully over time. Whereas chimpanzee nutcracking or ant dipping, they're good and they're adaptive, but there's no sense in which they get better over the generations. And in fact, I think there's archaeological evidence showing that chimpanzees have been nutcracking for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So they're not elaborating on it, they're not accumulating. So a big question that was kind of kicked off by Mike Tomasello, as you mentioned there, is how can we explain why humans have this cumulative cultural evolution, whereas other species have culture, but it doesn't accumulate over time. So people talk about the fidelity of transmission, fidelity of social learning. Maybe we're just better at passing on our knowledge from one individual to another, one generation to another. So if what you're copying, if you copy something and there's loads of errors, then it can't ratchet up, it can't accumulate. Other people have argued it might be just a population size thing. It might be a demographic thing. Other species just don't live in large enough populations in order to protect against the best